He bragged about his untouchable company while paying me pennies in the divorce after leaving me for his secretary. He had no idea I was the anonymous investor who purchased his failing business 6 months later. I watched him shake hands with the new owner's representative without recognizing his ex-wife standing right in front of him. Another late night at the office, Victoria. Don't wait up. Richard's text message glowed on my phone screen as I sat in my home office, surrounded by financial reports and acquisition proposals. Not his home office anymore, mine alone since he'd moved out 3 months ago to live with Melissa, his 26-year-old executive assistant. I closed the private equity firm's portal on my laptop and allowed myself a small, knowing smile. Richard had no idea who he was really texting with tonight. 12 years of marriage to Richard Blackwell had taught me many things. I'd watched him build Blackwell Analytics from a promising startup to a regional market leader. I'd hosted the dinner parties that secured his first major clients. I'd proofread the proposals, edited the presentations, and listened to every strategy he'd ever conceived. What he never bothered to ask was where I'd learned to do all that. Just handle the house, Victoria. Business is for people who understand. Numbers, he used to say with that condescending smile whenever I'd offer suggestions about his company's direction. The last time had been at the Hendersons' dinner party, 6 months before our separation. Victoria thinks we should explore the healthcare analytics market, he'd told his colleagues, chuckling as he swirled his 18-year-old scotch. Isn't that adorable? Next, she'll want to redesign our entire business model. The men around him had laughed, their wives offering me sympathetic glances. I'd simply smiled politely and refilled their glasses. What Richard never realized was that before I met him, I had graduated summa cum laude in finance from Wharton and quietly built my own investment portfolio since college. The cute online boutique business he dismissed as my hobby had grown into a dropshipping empire with annual revenues exceeding $4 million. I managed it all from my crafting room, actually a sophisticated trading office where I'd quadrupled my personal investments over the past decade. The boutique was just my cover. My real wealth came from angel investing in tech startups through a network of shell companies and private equity partnerships. The book club Richard joked about to his friends was actually a monthly meeting with 5 other women who collectively controlled over $100 million in investment capital. Poor Victoria, I'd overheard him tell Melissa once, thinking I couldn't hear through his home office door. She really has no concept of what it takes to build something significant. 3 months ago, when I found them together in his office, Richard had been almost casual about the betrayal. Victoria, let's be adults about this, he'd said, straightening his expensive Italian tie while Melissa adjusted her clothing. These things happen. We've grown apart. Melissa understands the pressures of my position in ways you never could. I'd said nothing, simply turned and walked out. My silence had been mistaken for shock and defeat, exactly as I'd intended. The divorce had been swift and brutal. His team of lawyers painted me as a contributing housewife with minimal income. Despite building the life that allowed his success, I walked away with our house and what he called a generous settlement that amounted to less than 15% of his company's stated value. Be grateful, he'd told me during our final meeting, his new diamond cufflinks glinting in the light of his attorney's office. Blackwell Analytics is untouchable, and I'm being more than fair. Your little online shop won't keep you in the lifestyle you're accustomed to, but that's not my problem anymore. What he didn't know was that I had been watching his company's financials for years. I knew about the overextended credit lines, the client dissatisfaction, and the cash flow problems his expansion had created. I knew about the lawsuit from their largest client that was being kept under wraps. I knew the vice president of operations was interviewing elsewhere. I knew Blackwell Analytics was one bad quarter away from a catastrophic cash crunch. In short, I knew his company was vulnerable, and I had the resources to do something about it. 6 months of patient waiting. 6 months of Richard believing he had won. 6 months of him and Melissa flaunting their relationship at industry events while his company quietly crumbled from mismanagement and his increasing absence from day-to-day operations. My phone buzzed again. Big announcement tomorrow. Finally secured the capital investment we needed. Blackwell Analytics is about to reach the next level. Thought you'd want to know what you're missing. I set down my phone and turned to the acquisition contract on my desk, bearing my signature from this morning. The logo at the top read Artemis Capital Partners, the private equity firm that existed only on paper, created through my network specifically for this purpose. The firm that had just completed the purchase of 76% of Blackwell Analytics shares at a steep discount to their real value. The irony was delicious. Richard had been so busy building his new life with Melissa that he'd missed the warning signs. By the time the company's board forced him to seek outside investment, my offer through Artemis was the only viable option on the table. He'd literally signed control of his life's work over to me without having any idea. Tomorrow, Richard would meet the representative of his company's new majority owner. Tomorrow, he would shake my hand without recognition, believing I was just another corporate executive. Tomorrow, the chess pieces I had carefully arranged over the past 6 months would finally begin to move. I look forward to tomorrow's announcement as well, I texted back, allowing myself this one small hint that would mean nothing to him now, but everything very soon. The digital clock on my desk flipped to midnight. In 8 hours, Richard Blackwell would discover exactly who had bought his precious company and what real power looked like. I adjusted the black Armani suit hanging on my closet door, a far cry from the homemaker clothes he was used to. Seeing me in, and smiled. I'd spent 12 years being underestimated by Richard Blackwell. Tomorrow, that would end. Morning arrived with the crisp certainty of a well-laid plan coming to fruition. I dressed methodically, each element of my appearance, a calculated choice. The tailored Armani suit, the Louboutin heels Richard had once refused to buy me, too extravagant for someone who just stays home. The elegant but understated jewelry I'd purchased with profits from my third successful angel investment. Gone. Was the soft, accommodating look Richard had expected from me during our marriage. My hair, normally worn in what he called my mom style, was now sleekly arranged in a power bob that had cost more than the monthly allowance he used to deposit in my account. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to the life Richard thought I lived. As I applied my makeup, my phone chimed with a message from Eleanor, my most trusted ally at Artemis Capital and one of the 5 women in my investment circle. Conference room secured at Blackwell for 10 a.m. Richard has been notified you're arriving as Artemis's chief acquisition officer. Legal team standing by. Are you ready for this? I typed a simple reply. Absolutely. The drive to Blackwell Analytics. Took exactly 17 minutes, just as it had the hundreds of times I'd driven Richard there for events over the years. The difference was that today, I wasn't arriving as Richard Blackwell's supportive wife, expected to smile vacantly while he described me to colleagues as my better half who keeps the home fires burning. Today, I was arriving as Victoria Sloan, my maiden name, professionally unused during our marriage, but the name under which I'd built my hidden financial empire. The Blackwell Analytics headquarters stood as a monument to Richard's ego, all. Glass and steel, designed by a famous architect whose fee had strained the company's finances during a critical growth phase, a decision I'd questioned and been dismissed for, even as I'd silently moved personal assets to cover potential fallout from his risky financial choice. Mrs. Blackwell? The young security guard looked confused as I approached the front desk. Visitor badge already prepared for me under my maiden name. Ms. Sloan, I corrected politely. Victoria Sloan, from Artemis Capital Partners. His eyes widened slightly with recognition of the company name. Oh, yes, of course. They're expecting you in the executive conference room. I accepted the visitor badge, noticing he'd crossed out Blackwell and hastily written Sloan above it. A small detail, but symbolic of the transition about to take place. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I reviewed what I knew about Richard's current state of mind. Through carefully placed sources, I'd learned he'd been boasting about the miraculous investment he'd secured, positioning it to his team as a testament to his business acumen rather than the desperate last-resort cash infusion it actually was. He'd spent the weekend celebrating with Melissa at the Four Seasons downtown, the same hotel where we'd spent our 10th anniversary, when he'd been too busy checking email to notice the special dinner I'd arranged. According to my sources, he'd ordered the same rare vintage champagne, telling the sommelier it was to celebrate the next chapter of his success story. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive reception area. Clarissa, the receptionist who had always been polite but distant to me during company functions, failed to recognize me at first. "Welcome to Blackwell Analytics. You must be from Artemis Capital," she said with a professional smile, then froze as recognition dawned. "Mrs. Black? I mean Ms. Sloan?" "Good morning, Clarissa," I replied calmly. "Yes, I'm representing Artemis today. I believe Mr. Blackwell is expecting me." Her fingers hovered uncertainly over her keyboard. Yes, of course. Let me just..." She fumbled with the phone. "Mr. Blackwell, your 10 o'clock is here. It's, Ms. Sloan from Artemis Capital." The confusion in her voice would have been amusing if I hadn't been so focused on the moment to come. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Richard adjusting his tie, his back to the entrance. Melissa sat beside him, tablet in hand, looking every bit the eager executive assistant and mistress combined. Around the table sat the company's senior leadership team, most of whom had attended dinners at my home, eaten food I'd prepared, and joined in Richard's dismissive laughter when I'd occasionally ventured business opinions. Clarissa put down the phone. "You can go right in." With each step toward the conference room, I shed another layer of the persona Richard had constructed for me in his mind. The doorway represented the threshold between his perception and my reality. I pushed open the door. Richard was mid-sentence, gesturing grandly as he often did when impressing clients. "Acquisition represents a vote of confidence in our vision. Artemis Capital clearly recognizes the untapped potential that..." He turned, his prepared smile freezing as our eyes met. For 3 excruciating seconds, his brain struggled to process the contradiction before him. I watched the mental calculations play out across his face. Victoria plus professional attire plus Artemis Capital representative does not compute. Victoria. Confusion, not recognition. He still didn't understand. "What are you doing here? We're in the middle of an important meeting." Several of the executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Melissa's face flushed deep red, her fingers tightening around her tablet. "I believe I am your important meeting, Richard," I said, my voice measured and professional. "Victoria Sloan, Chief Acquisition Officer for Artemis Capital Partners. I'm here to finalize our investment and discuss the transition plan." His laugh was immediate and dismissive, the same laugh I'd heard countless times when I'd made business suggestions. "Very funny, Victoria. Is this some kind of joke? Some attempt to embarrass me?" I set my briefcase on the table and removed the acquisition documents he had signed last week. "No joke, Richard. Artemis Capital Partners is my investment firm. We now own 76% of Blackwell Analytics." He snatched the papers from my hand, scanning them with increasing agitation. "This is impossible. Artemis is run by Edward Hamilton. I spoke to him myself." "Edward Hamilton is a consultant we hire for specific negotiations," I explained, taking a seat at the head of the table, his seat. "He represented our interests, but Artemis is my company." The blood drained from Richard's face as he flipped to the signature page, where my name was clearly listed as managing partner and majority shareholder of Artemis Capital. "You can't do this," he whispered, his familiar arrogance cracking. "You don't know anything about running an investment firm. You sell scented candles online. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. David Chen, the chief technology officer who had always been kind to me at company functions, was failing to suppress a smile. "Richard," I said calmly, "while you believed I was running a small online boutique from my craft room, I was actually managing a dropshipping empire with annual revenues of over $4 million. That was just my side project. My main focus has been Artemis Capital, which currently manages a portfolio valued at approximately $250 million. Melissa's tablet clattered to the table. "That's not possible." I turned to her with a professionally neutral expression. "Ms. Harrison, I believe you once helped Richard select an anniversary gift for me. A $200 necklace he felt was more than adequate for a housewife. That same day, I closed an angel investment round of $3.2 million for a healthcare analytics startup." I allowed myself a small smile. Ironic, given that Richard laughed at my suggestion that Blackwell Analytics should expand into healthcare. The room had gone completely silent. Richard's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and the beginning edges of fear. "This is some kind of trick," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't possibly have that kind of money." "Would you like to see my personal financial statements, Richard? The ones you never bothered to look at during our divorce because you were so certain I had nothing of value?" I opened my briefcase again and slid a folder across the table. "Your lawyers were remarkably uninterested in my assets. They didn't even ask the right questions." Richard stared at the folder without opening it, as if it might contain something dangerous. In many ways, it did. It contained the death of his perception of me. "Why would you hide this?" he finally asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "All these years?" "I didn't hide it, Richard. You simply never asked. You were so convinced of what I was that you never bothered to discover who I actually am." I turned to address the entire room. "Now, shall we discuss the future of Blackwell Analytics under its new ownership?" Richard's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. "You can't just walk in here and take over my company." David Chen cleared his throat. "Actually, Richard, legally she can. You signed the papers yourself last week." "I didn't know I was signing them for her." Richard's voice had risen to a near shout. "That's irrelevant from a legal standpoint," I said, gently removing his hand from my wrist. "The contracts are binding, regardless of who you thought was on the other end. A fact you've used to your advantage many times in business, if I recall correctly." The irony of using his own tactics against him wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several executives were now openly staring at Richard with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. "If everyone would please turn to page 3 of the presentation in front of you," I continued, taking control of the meeting as Richard sank back into his chair. "You'll see our proposed organizational changes and strategic direction for Blackwell Analytics moving forward." As the executives opened their folders, I caught a glimpse of Melissa silently gathering her things, preparing for a swift exit. She, at least, understood that her position had just become profoundly precarious. Richard sat motionless, staring at me as if seeing a stranger. In many ways, he was. The Victoria he thought he knew had never existed except in his own limited imagination. For 12 years, he had seen what he expected to see: a simple housewife, a supportive spouse with a cute hobby, a woman who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of his business world. His perception had been his weakness, and now it would be his undoing. The boardroom remained silent as I continued the presentation, methodically outlining the new direction for Blackwell Analytics. Richard sat frozen, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions as years of certainty crumbled around him. Melissa had retreated to the corner of the room, furiously texting, likely updating her resume if she had any sense. "As you can see from the projections," I continued, pointing to the screen where I'd displayed the 5-year plan, Our focus will shift toward healthcare analytics and predictive modeling for preventative medicine, a $12 billion market with substantial growth potential. David Chen, the CTO, leaned forward with genuine interest. This is remarkably similar to what you suggested at the Henderson dinner last year. You remember that? I asked, allowing a brief personal moment in the professional discussion. Of course, David nodded. It was the most insightful suggestion I'd heard in months. I actually brought it up in the next executive meeting, but... He stopped, glancing uncomfortably at Richard. But I shut it down, Richard finished, his voice flat. I said it showed a fundamental misunderstanding of our core competencies. The memory of that executive meeting, which Richard had mockingly recounted to me over dinner, flooded back. Actually, I corrected, you told David that Victoria probably read it in a magazine while getting her hair done, and that housewives shouldn't try to understand complex market dynamics. Several executives winced. Janet Rodriguez, the HR director, looked particularly mortified. That was a private executive meeting, Richard said defensively. Yes, I agreed. A meeting you described in great detail while we were at Toscana's, loudly enough that 3 neighboring tables could hear you laughing about how your wife thought she could contribute to business strategy. It wasn't the only time. As I stood at the head of the table, his table until today, memories of a dozen similar dismissals played through my mind like a well-worn film. There was the product launch party 3 years ago, where I'd suggested that their analytics dashboard needed a more intuitive interface for non-technical users. Richard had patted my hand like a child's. Sweetheart, he'd said, making sure his colleagues could hear. That's why we have customer service representatives. The actual product is for people who understand technology. 6 months later, they'd lost a major client because their leadership couldn't navigate the dashboard effectively. Richard had blamed the sales team for targeting technically illiterate clients, or the strategy retreat where I'd been invited as a +1 for the partners' dinner. I'd mentioned that the Asian market expansion seemed premature given currency fluctuations. Richard had laughed over his whiskey. Victoria thinks she's an economist now, he'd told the table. Next, she'll be giving us investment advice. Stick to planning the garden, honey. 2 quarters later, Blackwell Analytics had written off $2.3 million in losses from their failed Asian expansion. The most painful dismissal had come when I'd tried to warn him about Melissa herself. I'd noticed her unusual interest in Richard's personal schedule, the way she dressed for him rather than for the office, the late-night texts that made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. She's ambitious, I'd told him carefully over breakfast. It might be wise to assign her to another executive. People might get the wrong impression. He'd looked up from his phone with irritation. The wrong impression would be that my wife understands corporate dynamics better than I do. Melissa is an excellent assistant who actually supports my career instead of questioning my professional judgment. 3 weeks later, I'd found them together in his office. Let's move on to the personnel changes, I said, pushing the memories aside and touching the screen to advance to the next slide. The organization chart appeared, conspicuously missing 2 names, Richard's and Melissa's. Richard finally broke his stunned silence. This is vindictive and unprofessional. You're dismantling a successful company structure out of personal spite. I regarded him coolly. Successful? Richard, Blackwell Analytics has lost 16% market share in the past 18 months. Your client retention rate has dropped to 62%. You've burned through your cash reserves on an office renovation and executive retreats, while your core services have fallen behind competitors. The only reason you haven't faced a shareholder revolt is that you've been selectively sharing performance metrics. His face flushed dark red. That's a gross mischaracterization, is it? I pulled up the next slide, displaying the true performance metrics I'd painstakingly assembled through industry contacts. These numbers weren't in your investor presentations, were they? Marcus Weber, the chief financial officer, studied the screen with growing alarm. Where did you get these figures? From your own database, Marcus. Your security protocols need significant upgrading. Another issue we'll be addressing. I turned back to Richard. This isn't personal, it's business. Artemis Capital invests in companies with potential and removes obstacles to their success. In this case, you are the obstacle, Richard. The truth hung in the air between us. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't entirely true. This was both business and deeply personal, but my presentation had made it impossible to dismiss the business rationale. Richard tried a new approach, his voice dropping to the persuasive tone he'd often used when trying to talk clients into unfavorable contract terms. Victoria, let's be reasonable. We were married for 12 years. Whatever happened between us, you know I built this company from nothing. You can't just push me out. You built this company with my support, I corrected him. The dinner parties? I hosted to impress clients. The trips I canceled so you could use our personal funds for business expenses. The countless hours I spent listening to your strategies and offering insights you dismissed. I was investing in Blackwell Analytics long before Artemis Capital existed. I advanced to the next slide, which detailed the separation package I was offering him. You'll retain 5% ownership and a role as a non-executive consultant, with appropriate compensation. Considering the financial state of the company, it's more than generous. Richard stared at the figures, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. This is less than what I paid you in the divorce, he said quietly. Ironic, isn't it? You thought you were being generous with your housewife, who couldn't possibly survive without your support. I met his gaze directly. Tell me, Richard, how does it feel to be on the receiving end of someone else's generosity? He had no answer. For once in his life, Richard Blackwell was speechless. Janet from HR cleared her throat. What about the rest? Of the executive team? Most positions will remain unchanged, pending performance reviews, I explained. David, we'd like you to lead the development of our healthcare analytics platform. Marcus, your financial expertise will be valuable during the transition, though we'll be bringing in a forensic accounting team to review the books. The relief around the table was palpable as executives realized they weren't necessarily facing the same fate as Richard. Some were already mentally realigning themselves with the new power structure, exactly as I'd predicted. Melissa finally spoke up from her corner position. And what about me? Her voice wavered between defiance and fear. I considered her for a moment. In many ways, she was as much a victim of Richard's patterns as I had been, though she'd made her choices with open eyes. Your position as executive assistant will be eliminated. HR will provide a standard severance package and job placement assistance. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You can't do this to her. She's invaluable to the operation of this company. She? I asked mildly. Or is she valuable to you personally? Because her performance reviews suggest she's missed deadlines, mismanaged your calendar, and alienated several key team members. Melissa's face crumpled as she realized Richard wouldn't save her. He couldn't even save himself. I glanced at my watch. We'll take a 15-minute break. When we return, we'll discuss the transition timeline in detail. Richard, a word in your office, please. As the executives filed out, whispering amongst themselves, Richard remained seated, staring at the organizational chart that no longer included his name at the top. Coming? I asked from the doorway. He looked up, and for a brief moment I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before: respect, tinged with fear. He followed me down the hallway to his corner office, the office that would no longer be his after today. I closed the door behind us. The space was exactly as I remembered it from the day I'd discovered his affair. Expensive modern furniture, awards displayed prominently on the walls, the same couch where I'd found him with Melissa. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally. All those years. Why hide who you really were? I considered his question carefully. I didn't hide, Richard. I showed you exactly who I was, repeatedly. You chose not to see it. But the company, the investments. When we first met, I told you I worked in finance. You assumed that meant I was a bank teller, even though I told you I had an MBA from Wharton. When I suggested investment strategies, you laughed them off without ever checking their merit. When my little online shop grew, you never once asked about the numbers. You just assumed it was a hobby that made pocket change. I walked to the window that overlooked the city. Every dismissal, every interruption, every time you explained my own area of expertise to me as if I were a child. Those were your choices, Richard. Not mine. He sank into his chair, the expensive ergonomic chair I'd selected when he complained of back pain 3 years ago. So this is revenge? No, I said, turning back to face him. This is consequence. There's a difference. For the first time in our entire relationship, Richard Blackwell looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the woman I had always been, not the simplified version he had created in his mind. It was 12 years too late. As he sat in diminished silence, I thought about all the times he'd dismissed my insights, belittled my intelligence, or talked over me in conversations. I thought about the night before our wedding, when he'd joked to his groomsmen that he was taking one for the team by marrying a beautiful woman with a mediocre brain. I hadn't been supposed to hear that, but I had. Every dismissal, every casual cruelty had been stored away, not out of vindictiveness, but as evidence that I would someday need to judge his true character. And that evidence had eventually led me to this moment, standing in his soon-to-be former office, having finally forced him to see the reality he'd been dismissing all along. The board meeting reconvenes in 5 minutes, I said, moving toward the door. I suggest you use this time to consider your options carefully. The one thing no longer available to you, Richard, is dismissing me. As Richard and I returned to the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Executives who had previously aligned themselves with Richard now directed their attention toward me, their body language revealing the swift recalculation of allegiances that occurs when power changes hands. Melissa had not returned from the break, a wise decision on her part. While Richard slumped into a chair near the middle of the table, I resumed my position at the head, opening a secure tablet that contained the complete dossier on Blackwell, Analytics, a document far more comprehensive than anything Richard had ever compiled himself. What no one in that room understood, least of all Richard, was the extent of preparation that had led to this moment. This wasn't a hastily assembled revenge plan triggered by finding my husband with his secretary. This was the culmination of years of careful observation, strategic planning, and meticulous documentation. Before we continue, I began, I'd like to introduce someone joining us virtually. Eleanor Vega, my partner at Artemis Capital. The large screen on the wall activated, revealing Eleanor's commanding presence. At 58, with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, she projected the gravitas of someone who had navigated the male-dominated financial world for decades and emerged victorious. Good morning, Eleanor greeted the room. I've been looking forward to this acquisition for some time. Richard's head snapped up. Some time? This deal only came together in the last 3 weeks. Eleanor's smile was polite but carried an edge of amusement. Actually, Richard, Artemis Capital has been monitoring Blackwell Analytics for approximately 36 months. Victoria and I identified your company as a potential target with strong fundamentals, but suboptimal leadership nearly 3 years ago. The revelation hung in the air. 3 years ago, Richard and I had still been married, sleeping in the same bed, sharing meals and a life together, all while I had been silently evaluating his company for eventual acquisition. That's impossible, Richard sputtered. We would have noticed increased investor interest or unusual stock activity. Would you? I asked, pulling up another screen on my tablet. Your quarterly investor relations reports consistently miss tracking between 12 to 18% of your shareholder inquiries. Your IR team classified them as routine market research because they came through diversified holdings companies. I projected a slide showing a complex network of shell companies and investment vehicles, the elaborate structure I had established to quietly gather information and acquire small positions in Blackwell Analytics without triggering Richard's awareness. 5 different entities, each owning less than 2% of Blackwell shares, none of them visibly connected to Artemis Capital or to each other, I explained. Collectively, we already controlled nearly 10% of your company before the main acquisition even began. Marcus Weber, the CFO, studied the diagram with growing professional respect. That's remarkably sophisticated. What you're seeing, Eleanor added from the screen, is Victoria's specialty. She designed this acquisition architecture for several previous Artemis investments. We call it the invisible hand strategy. The irony of Richard learning that his wife, the woman he believed barely understood basic business concepts, had literally written the playbook on stealth corporate acquisitions wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 3 years, Richard repeated, still struggling to process the timeline. We were still married. Yes, I acknowledged. I began planning while we were still married, though I had no intention of actually executing the acquisition then. That changed when I found you with Melissa. Richard flinched at the direct reference to his infidelity in front of his executive team. But even before that catalyst, I continued, I had extensive contingency plans in place. It's what I do, Richard. I prepare for possibilities while others remain unaware. I advanced to the next slide, displaying a meticulous timeline of Blackwell Analytics vulnerabilities over the past 3 years. Cash flow problems, client dissatisfaction patterns, delayed product launches, executive turnover, all carefully documented and analyzed. While you believed I was planning dinner parties and managing our social calendar, I was actually creating this, I explained. A comprehensive vulnerability analysis of your company, updated weekly for 3 years. The executives stared at the detailed timeline with a mixture of alarm and amazement. It revealed a level of insight into their company's weaknesses that exceeded their own internal assessments. How did you access this information? David Chen asked, professional curiosity overriding his discretion. Multiple channels, I replied. Some was publicly available but required specialized analysis. Some came from industry contacts. And some, I paused, looking directly at Richard, came from you, Richard. I never gave you confidential company information, he protested. Not intentionally, I acknowledged. But you brought work home. You left financial reports open on your laptop while you showered. You rehearsed presentations in your home office, speaking loudly enough that anyone in the hallway could hear every detail. You took calls about sensitive company matters during our dinner parties, stepping just far enough away that you thought I couldn't hear. Richard's face drained of color as he realized how casually he had exposed his company's inner workings, believing his wife too uninformed to understand what she was overhearing. And then there were the dinner conversations, I continued. After a few drinks, you loved to complain about your incompetent team members, revealing exactly who was underperforming and why. You mocked clients who raised concerns, giving me perfect insight into your customer satisfaction issues. Your contempt for users who struggled with your interface told me exactly where your product was failing. I turned to the executive team. In essence, Richard provided me with an ongoing, unfiltered internal audit of Blackwell Analytics for years, never imagining I was capable of understanding or utilizing the information. Eleanor spoke up from the screen. Victoria maintained a secure database of these insights. When combined with our standard market analysis, it gave us unprecedented visibility into your operations. By the time Richard began seeking investment, due to cash flow problems, we had already prepared the perfect acquisition strategy tailored to Blackwell's specific vulnerabilities. The room was silent as the executives processed the thoroughness of our preparation. This wasn't luck or opportunity. It was methodical, patient strategy executed with precision. There's more, I continued, revealing another layer of my unseen preparations. While Richard believed I was attending cooking classes on Thursday evenings, I was actually meeting with my investment group, 5 women who collectively control over $500 million in investment capital. I displayed photos of my investment circle. Eleanor, Sophia Jung, former CFO of a Fortune 500 company. Diane Adeyemi, a venture capitalist specializing in tech acquisitions. Rebecca Goldman, an angel investor with over 30 successful exits. And Maria Vasquez, who had built and sold 3 analytics companies before age 40. We called ourselves the Thursday Club, I explained. Richard knew about it, but he thought we were, in his words, middle-aged women sharing recipes and whining about our husbands. Janet from HR couldn't suppress a small snort of disbelief. In reality, I continued, we were analyzing investment opportunities, developing acquisition strategies, and building Artemis Capital into what it is today. Maria, in particular, provided valuable insights into Blackwell Analytics' technical shortcomings compared to competitors. Richard stared at the images, particularly at Maria Vasquez. I pitched her company 3 years ago, he said quietly. She declined to partner with us, said our approach was outdated. Yes, I nodded. She told me about that meeting. You spent 45 minutes explaining basic analytics concepts to a woman who held 3 patents in the field. When she tried to ask technical questions, you suggested her assistant might take notes to help her understand later. That assistant was her CTO. More pieces were falling into place for Richard. The world he thought he understood had been operating on entirely different principles just beyond his awareness. The Thursday Club made its first joint investment 6 years ago, I continued. A medical imaging AI startup that sold to Google 18 months later for a 1,200% return. Since then, we've completed 27 successful investments and acquisitions. Blackwell Analytics is our largest acquisition to date, but far from our most complex. I advanced to the next slide, showing a sleek office space with the Artemis Capital logo prominently displayed at the reception desk. This is our headquarters in the Riverside Tower, I said. 10 blocks from here. I signed the lease 4 years ago, using the proceeds from my 3rd major investment exit. Richard's confusion was evident. But you were always home. You managed our household. How could you be running a company without me knowing? I worked while you were at the office, I explained. The household management you thought consumed. My day actually took me about 90 minutes each morning. The rest of my time was spent building Artemis Capital. I showed a final preparation slide, a meticulous timeline of Richard's company credit card statements, travel expenses, and meeting records over the past year, with Melissa's name highlighted throughout. When I began suspecting your affair with Melissa, I didn't confront you immediately. Instead, I accelerated our acquisition preparations. I documented every company resource you misused for personal matters with Melissa, every extended lunch, every unnecessary business trip where she accompanied you, every gift purchased on the company account. Richard stared at the evidence of his indiscretions, laid out in clinical detail. I wasn't just a betrayed wife, Richard. I was a strategic investor identifying a pattern of mismanagement that would make your company vulnerable to acquisition. The conference room was utterly silent. The depth of my preparation, maintained in absolute secrecy for years, had left everyone stunned. None more so than Richard, who was seeing for the first time the elaborate infrastructure that had been building around him while he remained completely oblivious. Your divorce settlement offer, he said finally, a horrible realization dawning. You didn't fight for more because I knew I'd be acquiring your company within 6 months, I finished for him. Why haggle over a few million in divorce proceedings when I could purchase controlling interest in your entire company instead? Artemis Capital acquired Blackwell Analytics for approximately 60% of its potential market value due to your cash flow problems and declining client retention. I closed my tablet, the demonstration of my years of unseen preparation complete. The divorce was never the endgame, Richard. It was merely a transition phase in a much larger strategy. Eleanor smiled from the screen. Victoria has always excelled. At the long game, it's why Artemis Capital has never failed in an acquisition target. The executives of Blackwell Analytics were now looking at me with new eyes, not as Richard's ex-wife or even as their new owner, but as someone whose strategic capacity vastly exceeded what they had previously encountered in their professional lives. For my part, I felt no need to gloat or emphasize Richard's blindness further. The evidence spoke for itself. Years of meticulous preparation, executed in plain sight of a man too convinced of his own superiority to notice, had led to this inevitable conclusion. Now, I said, returning to business, let's discuss the transition plan in detail. The transition. Meeting continued for another hour, with Eleanor and I outlining the immediate changes that would take place at Blackwell Analytics. Throughout the discussion, Richard remained uncharacteristically silent. His usual dominant presence diminished as he processed the complete inversion of the power dynamic he had taken for granted for so long. As we wrapped up, I assigned follow-up responsibilities to each executive and scheduled individual meetings for the coming days. Thank you all for your attention. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 to begin implementation. Richard, please stay behind. The executives filed out, some casting sympathetic glances at Richard, others already focused on securing their positions in the new regime. When the door closed, leaving just Richard, Eleanor on the screen, and me, the atmosphere shifted. "Why didn't you just destroy me after you found us together?" Richard finally asked, his voice hollow. "Why the elaborate charade of the divorce, letting me think I'd won, all of it?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow on the screen but remained silent, allowing me to respond. "It wasn't a charade, Richard. It was calculated restraint." I sat across from him, no longer needing to stand at the head of the table to establish authority. "When I walked in on you and Melissa that day, my first impulse was exactly what you'd expect. Anger, confrontation, immediate consequences. The memory of that moment washed over me. The shock of seeing them together, the instantaneous pain that had threatened to overwhelm my senses. For a woman less disciplined, less strategic, it might have triggered an immediate explosive reaction. "I remember you just turned and left," Richard said. "I thought you were in shock." "I was," I acknowledged, "but not in the way you assumed. I walked out of your office, got into my car, and drove directly to Eleanor's home. Not to cry on her shoulder, but to activate the contingency plan we'd already developed for Blackwell Analytics." Eleanor nodded on the screen. "Victoria arrived at my house completely composed. The first thing she said was, 'It's time to execute option 3. Richard looked between us, confusion evident. "Option 3? We had developed 4 potential scenarios for eventually acquiring Blackwell Analytics, I explained. Option 1 was a friendly acquisition after your planned expansion failed, which it was already showing signs of doing. Option 2 involved waiting for your retirement, which you occasionally mentioned was 5 years away. Option 3 was accelerated acquisition following a personal catalyst. Option 4 was walking away entirely if better opportunities emerged. The methodical nature of these options, prepared well in advance of his betrayal, seemed to disturb Richard more than any emotional reaction would have. Your affair with Melissa provided the personal catalyst for option 3, I continued. But even then, I didn't act immediately out of anger or hurt. Instead, I followed our established protocol, 72 hours of cooling off, followed by dispassionate re-evaluation. Eleanor picked up the explanation. For those 3 days, Victoria stayed at my guest house. We reviewed the complete Blackwell Analytics file, assessed current market conditions, calculated risks, and determined that accelerated acquisition was indeed the optimal strategy. Richard's expression revealed his struggle to reconcile the woman he thought he knew, the wife he expected to collapse in tears, beg him to reconsider, or lash out in immediate rage, with the calculating strategist who had coolly evaluated his betrayal as a business opportunity. "Those 3 days you didn't come home," he said slowly. "You told me you were staying with your sister." "A necessary misdirection," I said. "You called my sister to check, didn't you?" His slight flush confirmed it. "My sister has always been an excellent ally," I noted. "She told you exactly what I instructed her to, that I was devastated, barely eating, crying constantly. In reality, I was finalizing acquisition models with Eleanor and our team." Richard looked genuinely perplexed. "But when you came home, you were upset. We fought. You cried." "Of course I did," I acknowledged. "The end of a 12-year marriage, even one with significant problems, deserves genuine emotion. But my tears didn't prevent me from taking calculated steps toward the ultimate goal." I opened my tablet again, displaying a timeline of the 6 months between discovering his affair and today's acquisition reveal. Each step was meticulously documented: when I'd initiated divorce proceedings, when I'd reluctantly agreed to his unfavorable settlement terms, when Artemis Capital had begun making indirect overtures to Blackwell's board about potential investment. During our divorce negotiations, I deliberately appeared emotional and financially naive. Your lawyers sensed weakness and pushed for a quick settlement that minimized your financial exposure. I zoomed in on that period in the timeline. Meanwhile, I was having Eleanor approach your board members about capital concerns, carefully, manipulating variables to ensure you'd be seeking investment within 4 months. Richard stared at the timeline, seeing for the first time how his perceived victory in the divorce had been merely one step in my larger strategy. "Your celebration dinner at La Maison after the divorce was finalized," I continued. "You took Melissa there, ordered the 1982 Bordeaux, and told the sommelier you were celebrating freedom from dead weight." Richard paled. "How do you know that?" "The sommelier is married to one of our analysts at Artemis. Small world." I smiled slightly. "That same evening, I was finalizing the framework for the shell companies we'd use to begin acquiring Blackwell shares, the OR. Contrast couldn't have been clearer. While Richard had been celebrating what he thought was his triumph, I had been methodically advancing my strategy, undistracted by emotional impulses that might have derailed a less disciplined approach. "Even your childlike gloating served a purpose," Eleanor added from the screen. "Your overconfidence made you sloppy. You missed board meetings, delegated critical decisions, and accelerated the company's vulnerability." 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized, I continued, you posted that vacation photo of you and Melissa in Bora Bora, the destination you and I had discussed for our anniversary. The caption read, "Finally, with someone who appreciates the finer things." Richard winced at the reminder of his tactlessness. "That same day, I met with your largest client, Meridian Healthcare, ostensibly as a consultant. I identified 3 critical failures in your service delivery that you'd been ignoring. 2 weeks later, they reduced their contract by 30%. That was you?" Richard's voice rose in disbelief. "That Meridian reduction created the cash flow problem that forced us to seek investment." "Precisely," I nodded. "A calculated pressure point, applied at exactly the right moment. Not out of vengeance, but as part of a strategic sequence to create the conditions for our acquisition offer to be accepted. The methodical nature of my approach, using his betrayal not as a trigger for emotional retaliation, but as a catalyst for a carefully orchestrated business strategy, seemed to unnerve Richard more than any angry confrontation would have. At every point where emotion might have driven me to premature action, I chose restraint," I explained. "When you texted me accidentally, messages meant for Melissa about how much happier you were now, I didn't respond with anger. I documented them for potential use in shareholder discussions about your judgment." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Victoria's ability to compartmentalize emotion and strategy is unparalleled. It's what makes her so effective." Richard was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd failed to see. The day I asked for the divorce, you agreed so quickly. I thought you knew you had no choice. I remember that conversation clearly, I said. You came home with a prepared speech about growing apart and deserving happiness. You had talking points written on your palm. I could see them when you ran your hand through your hair, a nervous habit you've always had when lying. His involuntary glance at his own palm confirmed the observation. You expected tears, pleading, perhaps anger? I continued. Instead, I simply said, if that's what you want, I won't stand in your way. Your relief was palpable and telling. You had no idea that my quick agreement was strategic, not submissive. That night, after you left to clear your head, or rather, to celebrate with Melissa at the Westbrook Hotel, I made 3 calls, to my lawyer, to Eleanor, and to our investment team. By morning, the accelerated acquisition plan was in motion. Richard looked physically ill as he realized how thoroughly his actions had been anticipated, observed, and incorporated into a strategy that he had never suspected existed. When your lawyer pushed for that insulting settlement offer, suggesting that as just a housewife, I had contributed minimal value to your success. I paused, allowing Richard to recall his attorney's exact words. Eleanor advised me to fight for more. She knew we could get at least triple what you offered. Do you know why I didn't? Richard shook his head silently. Because fighting would have positioned me as desperately needing those resources. Accepting the lowball offer with minimal negotiation reinforced your perception of me as financially naive and emotionally defeated. It kept you complacent, Richard. Your victory needed to feel complete for our strategy to work. Eleanor smiled from the screen. That settlement agreement signing was the inflection point. Richard's guard came down completely after that. His public statements about moving forward with the right partner created multiple vulnerabilities we could exploit. I nodded in agreement. Your Instagram post of the new Porsche you bought Melissa, captioned, "She deserves the best," coincided exactly with our first indirect stock acquisition through Highland Partners, one of our shell companies. The timeline on my tablet highlighted the correlation between Richard's public displays of his new life and our systematic dismantling of his corporate security. When you texted me last month to check in, actually fishing for information about whether I was dating anyone new, I was in a board meeting finalizing the terms of this acquisition. I closed the tablet. Every time you acted impulsively, I responded with calculated restraint. Every move you made based on emotion, I countered with strategy. Richard sat in stunned silence, finally grasping the full extent of my calculated approach. The woman he had dismissed as too emotional, too naive to understand complex business strategy, had orchestrated his professional downfall precisely by controlling the emotions he had assumed would rule her actions. The restraint required to execute this strategy, Eleanor began, was considerable, I finished. There were moments when I wanted nothing more than immediate satisfaction, to expose the affair publicly, to fight for every penny in the divorce, to tell you exactly what I thought of your character. I stood, gathering my materials as I prepared to conclude this conversation. But immediate satisfaction is fleeting. Strategic patience yields far more substantial results. You taught me that, Richard, though not in the way you intended. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, you have a choice, I replied. Accept the consultant position with the terms outlined, or walk away with nothing. Either way, control of Blackwell Analytics transfers to Artemis Capital, effective immediately. Richard looked up, a shadow of his former arrogance briefly visible. And if I fight this legally? There must be regulations against a spouse using privileged information. By all means, pursue legal action, I said calmly. Our attorneys have prepared extensive documentation demonstrating that all information used in our acquisition strategy was either publicly available or obtained through standard industry channels. Your company's vulnerability was obvious to anyone paying attention. I simply paid closer attention than most, Eleanor added from the screen. Additionally, Richard, we've documented your extensive misuse of company resources during your relationship with Ms. Harrison. A legal battle would make those details public record. Your board members, now our board members, would be required to testify. The last traces of fight drained from Richard's posture. Calculated restraint doesn't mean inaction, I concluded. It means choosing the right action at the right time for the right reason. Today was always the right time. This outcome was always the right reason. I walked to the door, pausing before I left him alone with the ruins of the empire he thought was unassailably his. You once told me business requires emotional detachment, Richard. You were right about that, at least. The first week of transition at Blackwell Analytics unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. Each morning, I arrived at the company headquarters at precisely 7:30 a.m., a full hour before most executives. Each evening, I was among the last to leave, reviewing transition reports and preparing for the next day's strategic adjustments. Richard, to his credit, had chosen the pragmatic path, accepting the consultant position rather than walking away with nothing. Whether this choice stemmed from financial necessity or an inability to completely sever ties with the company he'd built remained unclear. What was evident, however, was the psychological toll of his new reality. On Thursday afternoon, I found him in what had once been his executive office, now converted to a shared conference space, staring at the wall where his awards and credentials had once hung. The Williams Group called, I said, breaking his reverie. They've requested you not attend the quarterly review. I've assigned David and Janet to handle it. The Williams Group had been Richard's personal recruiting achievement, a client he'd cultivated for years through golf outings, expensive dinners, and VIP sporting events. His expression revealed this latest loss keenly. They specifically asked that I not be there? His voice carried a hint of disbelief. Actually, they asked if the new management would be handling their account directly. When I mentioned you'd be available in a consulting capacity, they preferred to work with current leadership. I maintained a professional tone, neither gloating nor sympathetic. They also mentioned concerns about their last implementation. Apparently, there were significant issues you assured them were being addressed. Richard's jaw tightened. Those issues were scheduled for the next development cycle. I had everything under control. The documentation suggests otherwise. I placed a folder on the table. 6 months of unresolved tickets, 3 missed deadlines, and a temporary workaround that compromised data security. Not what I would call under control. As Richard flipped through the documented failures, I watched realization wash over him. These weren't just business missteps being highlighted by a new manager. They were his personal failures being cataloged by the woman whose marriage he had discarded as casually as these client concerns. I've scheduled a complete security audit for next week, I continued. Given the Williams findings, we need to verify that other clients haven't been similarly compromised. Richard closed the folder. Is this really necessary? Or is this just about increasing the pressure until I quit? I regarded him coolly. This isn't personal, Richard. It's proper business diligence, something you should appreciate. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. While the audit was legitimately necessary, the methodical exposure of Richard's professional shortcomings carried undeniable personal weight. Each revelation chipped away at the carefully constructed image he'd maintained, both to himself and to the business community. Richard Blackwell, visionary leader, impeccable businessman. The pressure wasn't just on Richard. Throughout the organization, my presence created a constant, subtle tension. Employees who had known me only as Richard's wife at company parties now scrambled to adjust to my role as CEO. Those who had witnessed Richard's dismissive treatment of me in the past seemed particularly anxious, wondering if I harbored resentments that might affect their positions. I addressed these concerns directly at the all-staff meeting on Friday morning, standing before 300 employees in the company auditorium. "Some of you know me from company events over the years," I began. "Others are meeting me for the first time this week. All of you are undoubtedly aware of my previous relationship with Richard Blackwell." The audience shifted uncomfortably, uncertain where this acknowledgement might lead. Let me be absolutely clear. Artemis Capital's acquisition of Blackwell Analytics is a business decision based on market opportunity and growth potential. Your performance will be evaluated on merit, your contributions valued based on results, and your future with this company determined by your work, not by your past association with previous management. Relief visibly swept through the room, though uncertainty lingered in many expressions. "That said," I continued, "this company will undergo significant changes in the coming months. The culture of selective accountability, of overlooked mistakes, and of performance evaluated based on personal relationships rather than results, that ends today." From my peripheral vision, I could see Richard standing at the back of the auditorium, his face carefully composed, but his posture rigid. "For those who have been held back despite your talents, who have watched less qualified colleagues advance through connections rather than competence, this transition represents opportunity. For those who have relied on protection from above rather than your own performance, consider this both a warning and an invitation to prove your actual value." The message landed exactly as intended: reassurance for the talented but overlooked, apprehension for those who had thrived under Richard's system of favoritism. The pressure was being systematically increased throughout the organization, creating an environment where true capabilities would emerge under stress. After the meeting, Eleanor called for our daily update. "How did the all-hands go?" she asked, her image crisp on my tablet screen. "As expected," I replied, closing my office door. Relief mixed with anxiety. The high performers are energized. The protected class is nervous. And Richard? Maintaining the consultant facade, but showing cracks. The Williams Group rejection hit him particularly hard. Eleanor nodded. "Good. Now it's time for Phase 2 pressure. Have you informed him about the board's special review yet?" "Scheduled for this afternoon," I confirmed. "The forensic accounting team has completed their preliminary findings." "Perfect timing," Eleanor smiled. "The industry rumors about Blackwell's financial irregularities are beginning to circulate. Richard's social invitations to the Princeton Club Charity Gala and the Tech Leadership Summit have both been misplaced." This was another element of our strategy, as questions about Blackwell's financial management under Richard's leadership spread through carefully placed industry whispers. His social capital was simultaneously being eroded. Invitations disappeared. Speaking engagements were reconsideration, and the business community that had once celebrated him began to maintain a cautious distance. "What about Melissa?" Eleanor asked. "HR processed her separation yesterday." "She's been remarkably quiet, signed the NDA without protest, and accepted the standard severance package." "Too quiet," Eleanor observed. "Our sources say she's been meeting with Patricia Winters." Patricia Winters was a notorious attorney who specialized in workplace harassment and discrimination cases. If Melissa was consulting with her, despite signing the NDA, it signaled potential complications. "I'll have legal prepare for possible action," I noted, though the documentation of their affair using company resources should provide adequate leverage. "Double-check the evidence custodial chain," Eleanor advised. "Richard might try to claim you collected that evidence improperly as his spouse, EO." Conversation continued with the precise, strategic focus that characterized all our interactions. No emotional detours, no celebration of victories, simply methodical planning of next steps to maintain pressure from all directions. At 3:00, I convened the special board review in the main conference room. Richard sat at the far end of the table, no longer in his accustomed position of authority, but as a reluctant participant in his own professional dissection. "Thank you all for making time for this critical review," I began, nodding to the forensic accounting team seated to my right. Martin Crawford and his team have completed their preliminary analysis of Blackwell Analytics' financial management over the past 3 years. Martin, please proceed. Martin, a silver-haired forensic accountant, with a reputation for merciless thoroughness, opened his presentation with a statistical overview of his findings. Our review identified 173 financial irregularities requiring further investigation, he began, his British accent lending additional gravity to the numbers. These range from minor expense account discrepancies to potentially significant reporting errors in quarterly financials. Richard straightened in his chair. That's absurd. Our financial controls are robust, and our reporting has always been impeccable. Martin smiled thinly. Perhaps you should reserve judgment until you've seen the evidence, Mr. Blackwell. The presentation that followed was a masterclass in methodical deconstruction. Martin's team had traced every financial thread, identified every irregularity, and documented every questionable decision. The collective weight of these findings created a devastating picture of financial mismanagement bordering on negligence. Most damaging were the slides detailing Richard's personal use of company resources. The business development trips that coincided with his and Melissa's romantic weekends. The client entertainment expenses at high-end restaurants where no clients were present. The consulting fees paid to shell companies that seemed to provide no actual services. As the evidence mounted, I watched Richard's expression cycle through. Disbelief, anger, and finally the dawning recognition that he had nowhere to hide. These weren't vindictive accusations from a bitter ex-wife. They were dispassionate findings from respected financial professionals who had meticulously documented every allegation. The board will need to determine appropriate next steps, I concluded, after Martin finished his presentation. Given the potential liability issues, we may be obligated to self-report certain findings to regulatory authorities. Richard's face paled. You can't be serious. Any regulatory investigation would devastate the company's reputation. Your company now. We're well aware of the potential impact, I replied calmly, which is why we've already prepared a damage control strategy that focuses on the changes in oversight and governance since the acquisition. The narrative will emphasize that these issues occurred under previous management and have been proactively addressed by new leadership. The implication was clear. Richard would bear the brunt of any regulatory consequences, while the company under my leadership would be positioned as the responsible actor who identified and corrected the problems. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Richard's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. That's my job, I replied simply. To anticipate problems and develop solutions. It always has been. As the board members filed out, processing the troubling financial revelations, Richard remained seated, staring at the presentation still displayed on the screen. Was this your plan all along? He asked when we were alone. To destroy not just my company, but my reputation? I sat across from him, maintaining professional distance despite the personal nature of his question. My plan was to acquire an undervalued company with strong potential hampered by poor leadership. The state of that company's finances and the reputation of its former CEO are direct consequences of decisions you made long before I entered the picture professionally. I gathered my materials, preparing to leave. The increasing pressure you're feeling, Richard, isn't engineered vindictiveness. It's the natural result of proper business diligence shining light on areas you preferred to keep in shadow. That's convenient, he said bitterly. You get to dismantle my life while claiming it's just business. Much like you dismantled our marriage while claiming it was just about growing apart, I countered, allowing a rare moment of personal sentiment to surface. Actions have consequences, Richard. You're experiencing the professional consequences of your choices, just as I experienced the personal consequences of your infidelity. I walked to the door, pausing before exiting. The difference is that I used my consequences as motivation to build something stronger. You might consider doing the same. As I closed the door behind me, The weight of the day's revelations hung in the air. The pressure was building from all sides: financial scrutiny, professional isolation, social rejection, potential regulatory investigation. Richard's carefully constructed world was being systematically compressed, forcing truths to the surface that had long been buried beneath layers of charm, confidence, and selective accounting. And we were just getting started. The systematic pressure on Richard continued for 2 weeks. Each day brought new revelations of mismanagement, distancing of former allies, and evidence of consequences cascading from years of poor decisions. Tuesday morning, my assistant interrupted a finance meeting with an urgent message. "Ms. Sloan," security called. "There's a situation in the lobby with Mr. Blackwell." I found Richard engaged in a heated confrontation with security officers. His appearance was shocking. Disheveled, unshaven, his typically immaculate attire replaced by wrinkled clothes. "Tell these rent-a-cops who I am," he demanded. "They're treating me like some random intruder in my own building." The lobby had gone. Silent, employees and visitors watching the scene with uncomfortable fascination. "Richard," I said calmly, "let's take this somewhere private." "Private?" He laughed bitterly. "Like how you privately orchestrated my downfall? Like how you're privately spreading rumors that I mismanaged this company?" Once alone in a conference room, Richard paced like a caged animal. "This has gone far enough, Victoria. The board meeting tomorrow, you're planning to remove me entirely, aren't you? Even the consulting position was just temporary, a way to humiliate me further before cutting me off completely." His assessment wasn't entirely wrong. The board was indeed scheduled to vote on terminating his consulting arrangement based on the forensic accounting findings. "Richard, sit down," I said firmly. "You're not helping your case by behaving this way." To my surprise, he complied, collapsing into a chair. "It's not just the company," he said quietly. "It's everything. Melissa left. Did you know that? Said she couldn't handle the negative attention from being associated with me. My club membership is under review. 3 speaking engagements canceled. My mother called to ask if the rumors about financial improprieties were true. I'm sorry to hear you're struggling. Have you considered that these are the natural consequences of your choices, not a coordinated attack?" He looked up, hollow-eyed. "Don't give me that corporate line. This is you. All of it. The perfect revenge executed flawlessly. Is that what you think this is? Revenge? What else would you call it?" I considered his question carefully. Was this revenge? Had my methodical dismantling of his professional life been motivated by personal pain? "I call it justice," I said finally. "Not in an emotional sense, but in the most fundamental meaning of the word. Your actions, both personal and professional, created imbalances. What you're experiencing now is the natural correction of those imbalances." Richard stared at me, trying to process my words through his emotional haze. "The forensic accounting didn't fabricate evidence, Richard. Your financial mismanagement was real. The client dissatisfaction existed before I took control. Your affair with Melissa and your callous handling of our marriage, those were your choices. All I did was remove the protective barriers that had insulated you from consequences. So what happens now? You've won. The company is yours. My reputation is in tatters. Is that enough for you?" "This was never about winning," I said, surprising myself with the realization. "This was about value correction." "Value correction?" he repeated blankly. "Yes. You consistently undervalued me, my intelligence, my capabilities, my contributions to both our marriage and your business success. Meanwhile, you overvalued yourself, your business acumen, your leadership qualities, your importance to the company's success." I leaned forward slightly. "The acquisition of Blackwell Analytics wasn't personal vengeance, Richard. It was the market accurately valuing what you had consistently mispriced." "I don't know how to come back from this," Richard admitted, an unprecedented vulnerability in his voice. For the first time since discovering his affair, I felt something shift within me. Not forgiveness, but a release. "Perhaps you start by accepting reality," I suggested, my tone softening. "The reality of your actual capabilities, not the inflated self-image you've maintained. The reality of your responsibility for your current situation." "The board meeting. Tomorrow," he began hesitantly. "We'll proceed as planned," I finished. "Your consulting arrangement will be terminated based on the forensic accounting findings. That's a business decision that can't be reversed." His shoulders slumped. "However," I continued, "Artemis Capital has been approached about a potential joint venture in the healthcare analytics space, a startup seeking experienced advisors for their technical implementation." Interest flickered in his eyes, the first positive emotion I'd seen from him in weeks. "Your technical knowledge of analytics architecture is still valuable, Richard, despite your management shortcomings. I could recommend you as an independent technical advisor to this venture. No management responsibilities, no financial control, purely advisory on the technical side." "Why would you do that?" he asked, suspicious. "Because destroying you was never my objective," I replied honestly. "Correcting the imbalance was. Establishing true value was. At this point, continuing to apply pressure serves no strategic purpose." "This isn't charity or forgiveness," I clarified. "It's pragmatic realignment. You have genuine technical talents that were obscured by your overreach into areas where you lacked competence." For the first time, Richard nodded with something approaching genuine understanding. "I never really saw you, did I?" "No," I agreed. "You didn't. And I never really saw myself either." This admission represented a significant shift, the first acknowledgement that his perception had been flawed not just of me, but of himself as well. "I'll have HR send you the startup's information," I said, moving toward the door. "Victoria," he hesitated. "Thank you isn't the right phrase, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. But I want you to know, I see you now. Too late, but I do see you." I nodded once, accepting his statement without needing to validate it. "Goodbye, Richard." 3 months later, I reviewed Blackwell Analytics' first quarter performance with Eleanor. The company had not only stabilized, but was showing strong growth, particularly in the healthcare segment I had championed years ago. "And Richard?" Eleanor asked. "Any further issues?" "None," I replied. "He's been working with that healthcare analytics startup, strictly technical advisory as agreed." "And personally?" Eleanor asked. "Has this provided the closure you needed?" I considered her question. The systematic acquisition of Richard's company had indeed corrected the imbalance between us. But the true resolution had come when he finally saw himself and me clearly. "It was never about hurting him," I said. "It was about establishing truth. His betrayal with Melissa was painful, but his dismissal of my capabilities over the years was the deeper injury. And now? Now, truth has been established. My capabilities are self-evident. His limitations are equally clear." The most satisfying aspect wasn't taking his company or exposing his weaknesses, I reflected. It was the moment he finally saw me clearly, not as his perception of me, but as I actually am. Richard had betrayed me for his secretary, then discovered I was the anonymous investor who purchased his failing company. But the true revelation, for both of us, went far deeper than that dramatic moment of recognition. He had finally seen, and more importantly, I had fully recognized my own value, independent of anyone else's assessment, a truth that no betrayal could ever diminish again.